Hello and welcome to Straight Until Disney, a Disney deep dive and analysis podcast, where each week I, your host Jonathan, takes a deep dive into the history of each Disney film and the legacy that they left behind. I'd like to remind you that you can follow me on Instagram at StraightUntilDisneyPod, and you can email me your thoughts at straightuntildisneypod@gmail.com. Hello and welcome to this week's podcast, where we're going to be diving into Lady and the Tramp. And like last week, there's not been too much mousekeeping, so I'm going to just swiftly move on into the production history. The only noteworthy news is that The Devil Wears Prada 2 is now playing in theaters, and I will have just come back from the Pixar Mundo meetup, which I have plans to deep dive and discuss in future videos. Lady and the Tramp, 1955, was directed by Hamilton Luske, Clyde Geronimi, and Wilfred Jackson. The film was produced by Walt Disney. The film's story was by Edmund Penner, Joe Rinaldi, Ralph Wright, and Dan. The film's story was by Edmund Penner, Joe Rinaldi, Ralph Wright, and Don DeGrande. The film's story was by Edmund Penner, Joe Rinaldi, Ralph Wright, and Don DeGrande. The film stars Barbara Luddy. as Lady. The film stars Barbara Lodi as Lady, Annette, Colette, and Danielle. Larry Roberts as Tramp. Bill Rackham as Trusty. Bill Thompson as Jock. Paul Duchess. Bill Thompson as Jock. Right, I'm going to just do that again because we're going to... This bit gets clogged up by this, so I'm just going to say the names. The film stars Barbara Luddy. The film stars Barbara Luddy. The film stars Barbara Luddy, Larry Roberts, Bill Buchan, Bill Thompson, Stan Freberg, Verna Felton, Verna Felton, Alan Reed, Peggy Lee, George Givot, Dallas McKinnon, Lee Miller, and the Mellamans. Music was by Oliver Wallace. The film's music was by Oliver Wallace, and the film was edited by Don Holliday. Studios was Walt Disney Productions, and its distributor was Buena Vista Film Distribution. The film was released June 22nd, 1955, with a running time of 78 minutes. With a running time of 76 minutes. The film was released in England. The film was released in English with a budget of $4 million and a gross revenue of $1.87 million. Lady and the Tramp is the 1955 American animated musical. Lady and Tramp is the 1955 American romantic musical comedy. Lady and the Tramp is the 1955 animated musical. Lady and Tramp is the 1950. Lady and the Tramp is the 15th animated film in the Disney canon and was the animated musical romantic comedy film produced by Walt Disney Productions. The, f- hmm, the film is based on Ward Green's 1945. The film is based on Ward Green's 1945 magazine story, Happy Dog, the Cynical Dog. There's not much else. Maybe this one won't take that long. The plot. Oh, hang on. Interesting. I'm now not in center. There. That's why I was like, I'm now not in center. Hang on a second. That's why. Right. Sorry, everyone. The reason why this is taking so much longer is because that's really small. 1 second. 1 minute. Thank you. Let me just scroll back. The plot of the film centers on Lady, a female American. The plot of the film centers around Lady, an American border collie who lives with her owners, and Tramp, a male stray mutt, whom she falls in love with. The film is the first film not to be distributed by RKO Radio Pictures, and was also the first of Disney's feature films to be released in CinemaScope widescreen processors. Whilst it was a modest success at the time, it is now considered one of Disney's greatest beloved classics. A direct-to-video sequel was released in 2001, and a live-action recreation of the film was released in 2019 as part of the Disney Plus streaming launch. So, starting with the production notes here, we're going to look at some of the earlier drafts of the characters that are noted here that I found really interesting before we dive into some of the production notes. So, in original drafts of the script, Trump was first to be called Homer, then Rags, and then Bozo. So, interestingly, they were looking at other names to call Tramp. Which isn't uncommon when it comes to films and drafts, that the names that they settled on weren't the original names. I certainly get that. However, as in the final film, Tramp never refers to himself as a proper name, although most of the fellow K9 cast refer to him as the Tramp. So therefore, it's kind of like his nickname. So we don't actually ever really know what Tramp's true name is. Tramp is given other names by the families that he visits, such as Mike and Fritzy, but when he was adopted by however, when he was adopted by Jim Darlin and oh my god. However, when Jim Deere and Darlin adopted Tramp, it was confirmed that his name must be Tramp. No. However, when Jim Darlin and oh my god. However, when Jim Deere and Darlin adopted him, they named him Tramp, which is confirmed in most comics and the film's own sequel. Aunt Sarah, the character that eventually became Aunt Sarah, was softened in the movie. And that's in comparison to early drafts and treatments of the film. In the film, she is a well-meaning busybody and revealed to be the sister of Darling's mother. She's a well-meaning. In comparison with early treatments of the film, in the final film, she is a well-meaning busybody aunt, revealed to be the sister of Darling's mother in the original green novel, who adores her cats. Earlier drafts of the film had Aunt Sarah appear more as a stereotypical meddling and overbearing mother. Earlier drafts of the film had Aunt Sarah appearing as a more stereotypical meddling and overbearing mother-in-law. While she is antagonistic towards Lady and Tramp at first, she sends them a box of dog biscuits for Christmas to make amends for having so badly misunderstood them, which I find really interesting here, that there's no real villain of Lady and the Tramp, if we're going to be totally honest. This film doesn't need a villain. Despite the fact that Aunt Sarah appears to be this antagonistic, but it's more of a misunderstanding compared to I'm completely evil. I want, like, some of the villains that we've seen so far, like Lady Tremaine's cold and calculating demeanour, Captain Hook's murderous intent, malevolence that we're going to get towards in the next film. So really, it's more of a misunderstanding, and it's more of a wires crossed kind of situation that she does actually apologise for, and we get to see a real development of this character. So, earlier drafts of the storyline that were drafted within 1943 had the two cats, So earlier drafts of the film, drafted in 1943, had Cyan and the two cats appear as secondary antagonists. They were originally named Nip and Tuck. In Ward Green's novelisation, they fearfully represent. In Ward Green's novelisation, they fear is that tearfully or fearfully? Tearfully. In Ward Green's novelisation, they tearfully express remorse over causing Tramp's impending execution. In blah blah blah. In Ward Green's novelisation, they tearfully express remorse at causing Tramp's impending execution by hiding the rat's body as a joke, and then they try to make amends. While in the film, they do not partake. Whilst in the final film, they do not partake of the climatic scene, which is a really interesting thing to note here, that these characters kind of take a back seat to the rest of the characters at play, which is a really interesting and dynamic thing to see here. During pre-production, Jim Deere was known as Jim Brown, and Darling was named Elizabeth. Those were dropped to highlight Lady's point. These names were dropped to highlight Lady's point of view, because at the end of the day, this is Lady in the Tramp's film, and we're seeing things throughout Lady's point of view. So she's not going to call them Elizabeth. She's going to call them her owners, her dad. So we understand why. In a very early version, published as a in a very early version of the film that was published as a short story in 1944, Disney's Children anthology, Lady refers to them as Mr. and Mrs. To maintain a dog's perspective, Darling and Jim's faces are barely shown. The background artists made models of the interiors of Jim, Deere, and Darling's house, and shot photos and film at a low perspective as a reference to maintain a dog's view. So we're keeping this idea that this film is through Lady's perspective, and the way that they're using the camera angles is to perceive that and allow audience to understand how a dog might see the world. The film's opening sequence in which Darling unwraps a pet. The film's opening sequence in which Darling unwraps a hat box on Christmas morning and finds Lady inside is based upon an actual incident in Walt Disney's life when he presented his wife Lillian with a chow puppy as a gift in a hat box. Aww. That's cute. And that just really shows how Walt Disney was bringing his own experiences and things that he knew into his works, and allowing this kind of unique perspective into seeing things from his life as well within these films, and using those to create lasting long memories. And it also allows audiences to take a bit of a deeper look into him as well and understand some of the things that he's gone through life and the small instances that have really allowed him to develop these unique and compelling stories through these characters by using parts of his life as reference to really allow unique stories. Beaver in this film is in a similar vein to the character of Gopher from the Winnie the Pooh franchise, and that's down to the speech pattern, a whistling noise when he makes the sound. This voice was created by Stan Freberg, who has an extensive background in commercials and comedy recordings. On the Lady and the Tramp Platinum Edition DVD, he He demonstrates how this effect was done, and that a whistle was eventually used because it was difficult to maintain the effect. The rat, a somewhat comical character at some The rat, a somewhat comical character in some of the early sketches, became a great deal more frightening due to the rat, who was a somewhat comical character in some early sketches, became a great deal more frightening due to the rat, a somewhat more comical character in some earlier sketches, would become a great deal more frightening due to the need for a much more dramatic tension within the scene that the rat is a part of, and that just shows how development process goes. That one character can be a certain way within earlier drafts and then still being used, but in a new way that allows him to fit into the new narrative that they're trying to discuss and tell, and wanted to create this more dramatic tension within the piece by allowing for a more resolute and satisfying ending to this film, and that allows his character to have a really important role within the film. In 1937, Disney storyman Joe Grant approached Disney with the sketches that he'd made of his Springer Spaniel named Lady, and some of her regular antics. And I just love and adore that these characters actually had existed. These are really based on real animals, and I really love that. And I don't think I've ever known the origins of where Lady came from, because the idea behind how Lady looks, how Lady acts, comes from Grant's dog. Disney enjoyed the sketches and told Grant to put them together as a storyboard. When Grant returned with his boards, Disney was not pleased, and the story was shelved. Aww. I'm invested. Like, in 1943, Walt read in The Cosmopolitan a short story written by Ward Green called Happy Dan the Whistling Dog. He was interested in the story and bought the rights to it. By 1949, Grant had left the studio, but Disney's storymen were continuously pulling Grant's original drawings and story off the shelf to retool. Finally, a solid story began taking shape in 1953. Based on Grant's storyboards and Green's short story. Green later wrote a novelization of the film that was released 2 years before the film itself, at Walt Disney's insistence, so the audiences would be familiar with the story. Grant didn't receive. Yeah. Grant did not receive credit for any story work in the film, an issue that animated. Grant did not receive any credit for any story work in the film, an issue that animating director Eric Goldberg hoped to rectify in the Lady and the Tramp Platinum Edition's release. It's understandable here that, despite the fact that yes, Grant had left the studio at this time, but it was still his storyboards. It was still that that they'd retouched. So you would have hoped that he would have at least been given some credit for some of the original drafts. But no, and it's kind of sad to see that that was the case then, and hopefully it ended up being rectified by Goldberg on the Platinum release. But you can understand why there would be some frustration there when it comes to the idea of credits and story ideas, because ultimately this began in the 1930s with a small idea and a few sketches that would then become the Lady and the Tramp film that we love and adore today. So you can understand why there's some hesitance and some little bit of frustration when it comes to credits, when it comes to Walt Disney. And that was done so in a behind-the-scenes vignette that explained Grant's role on the film. CinemaScope. Broadcasting CinemaScope. I had to. Right. What is really interesting and what cements Lady and the Tramp as such a success, and to be fair, what really brought us into a new age of cinema was the idea of CinemaScope. Now, CinemaScope is presented in an aspect ratio of 2.551. It is to date the widest film that Disney has ever produced. Sleeping Beauty, the next film that we're going to dive into, was also produced for an original 2.5501 aspect ratio, but was never presented to theatres this way. Which is really interesting, and we'll dive more into that in the next episodes. We'll dive more into that when we get to Sleeping Beauty. However, it is nevertheless presented on its original 2.55 or 1 aspect ratio on the DVD Platinum Edition release. However, the new innovation of CinemaScope presented more additional problems for the animation. So even though we had this new innovation of CinemaScope that was allowing to be much wider across the screen, this produced additional problems for the animators. The expansion of the canvas would make it difficult for a single character to dominate the screen, and the groups must be spread out across the screen to keep the screen from appearing sparse. Longer takes became necessary since constant jump cutting would seem too busy or annoying, and layout artists essentially had to reinvent their technique. Animators had to remember that they could move their characters across a background instead of the background passing behind them. The animators would overcome these obstacles during their action scenes, such as the tramp killing the rat. However, some character development was lost as there was more realism but fewer close-ups, therefore less involvement with the audience. Which is understandable that they've had up to now almost a decade to work out how to create the animation across screen. We've known from diving into these, creating humans in animation was so difficult for them that creating these vast scenes on the original format and aspect ratio, it was so difficult that it took them a long time to get to that point. So now we're introducing even more new ways of using the screen. You can understand why there was so much struggle. There was so much, like, it took them a long while to understand how to be able to craft for a much more lighter aspect ratio, and it not to feel like it was too busy, not to feel like it was too sparse. So you can understand why this film was really a blueprint for what would come next. More problems would arise as the premiere date got closer, although CinemaScope was becoming a growing interest in moviegoers. Not all theatres had the capabilities at the time. So that's something we're seeing now, to be honest. That is interesting is that obviously as an example of an example that I can give for you that is a lot of theatres don't. So a lot of movie theatres don't have the capacity for films that are just shot completely on millimeter film, such as Oppenheimer. The Odyssey is shot completely on film. That's coming out this year by Christopher Nolan. Both of those films are by Christopher Nolan, but still, a lot of theatres don't have the capacity for that. So we're now trying to see if theatres are able to kind of go back to allowing and having the capacity for films that were just shot completely on film, which is a really interesting, unique thing to look at in the film world at the moment, is how that's doing it. But you can understand that they didn't have the capacity to be able to house films that were completely filmed on CinemaScope because the cinemas, the theatres, they hadn't had the ability to incorporate that yet. So what did Walt do? So how did Walt combat this? Well, he created two versions of the film. One in widescreen and another in the original aspect ratio. This involved gathering the layout artists to restructure key scenes when characters were on the outside area of the screen. Which is a really interesting thing to think about, that there is two versions of this film that exist in the zeitgeist. There are two versions of this film that exist within the zeitgeist. The finished film is slightly different to the finished film is slightly different to what was originally planned. Although both the original script and the final product shared most of the same elements, it would still be revised and revamped. Originally, Lady was to have only one next door neighbor, a Ralph Bellamy type canine named Hubert. Hubert was later replaced by Jock and Trusty. A scene created but then deleted was one in which, while Lady fears of the arrival of the baby, she has a parade of the shoes. While Lady fears of the arrival of the baby, she has a parade of the shoes nightmare, similar to that of Dumbo's Pink Elephant on Parade nightmare, where a baby booty split in two. Then where a baby booty splits in two, then four, and continues to multiply. The dream shoes then fade into real shoes, their wearer exclaiming that the baby has been born. Another cut scene after Trusty says, "Everybody knows a dog's best friend." Another cut scene was after Trusty says, "Everybody knows a dog's best friend is their human." This leads to Tramp describing a world where the rules of both dogs This leads to Tramp describing a world where the roles of both dogs and humans are switched. The dogs are the masters and vice versa. Prior to being just a tramp, the character went through a number of suggested names, including Homer, Rags, and Bozo. It was thought in the 1950s that the term tramp would not be acceptable, but since Walt Disney approved of the choice, it was considered it was considered safe under his acceptance. On early storyboards shown on the backstage of Disney's DVD. On some storyboards shown on the backstage, Disney DVD had listed On early storyboards shown on the backstage, Disney DVD had listed description: a tramp dog with Homer or one of the mentioned prior names. On Christmas Day 1909, Jim Deere gives his wife Darlin. On Christmas Day 1909, Jim Deere gives his wife Darlin a Cocker Spaniel puppy, whom she names Lady. Growing up, Lady enjoys a happy life with them and a pair of dogs from the neighbourhood, a Scottish Terrier named Jock and a bloodhound named Trusty. Meanwhile, across town, by the railway, a friendly stray, silver mutt, referred to as Tramp, dreams to live in a home. He is begging for scraps from an Italian restaurant or protecting his fellow strays. A Pekingese named Peg and a bulldog named Bull from the local dog snatchers. At one point, Lady sees a big, sinister-looking rat trying to sneak into the yard and chases it away. Later, Lady is saddened after Jim Deere and Darlin begin treating her rather coldly. Jock and Trusty visit her and determine that the change in behaviour is due to Darlin expecting a baby. While Jock and Trusty try to explain what one is, the eavesdropping Tramp enters the conversation and offers his own opinions. Jock and Trusty take an immediate dislike to him and order him out of the yard. In due time, baby Jim Jr. arrives and Jim Deere and Darlin introduce Lady to him. Soon after, Jim Deere decides to go on a trip. The Darlin didn't want to join, but had no choice. Aunt Sarah arrives to look after Jim Jr. and the house. When Lady clashes with Aunt Sarah's Siamese cats, C and Am, she takes Lady to a pet shop to get a muzzle. A terrified Lady escapes, but is pursued by some stray dogs. Tramp sees the chase and rescues her. When they arrive at the zoo, Tramp distracts the zoo security guard and a professor to let them start fighting. So he and Lady can get in. They then find the zoo animals where Tramp tricks a beaver into removing the muzzle. That night, Tramp shows Lady how he lives. Footloose and collar free, culminating in the most iconic candlelit spaghetti dinner. As Tramp escorts Lady back home, his last thing is to chase hens in a chicken coop, and then he is through being a stray. When they flee, Lady is caught by the dog catcher. At the pound, the other dogs admire her license, as it is her way out of there. It also turns out that they have known Tramp, and the dogs reveal to Lady that Tramp Tramp's had multiple girlfriends in the past, and feel it is unlikely that he'll ever settle down. Eventually, Lady is collected by Aunt Sarah, who chains her to the dog hound, and chains her. Eventually, Lady is collected by Aunt Sarah, who chains her to her doghouse. In the backyard, Jock and Trusty visit to comfort her and tell her that strays aren't allowed to be adopted. When Tramp arrives to apologize, thunder starts to rumble as she angrily confronts him about his past sweethearts, after which he sadly leaves. They're having a domestic. Moments later, as it starts to rain, Lady sees the same rat from before, trying to sneak into the yard again. While it is afraid of her, it is able to evade her and enter the house. She barks frantically, but Aunt Sarah yells at her to be quiet. Tramp hears her and runs back to help. He enters the house and finds the rat in Jim Jr.'s room, and the two engage in a vicious fight. Lady breaks free and races inside to find the rat on Jim Jr.'s crib, as it had intended on killing him. Tramp pounces on it, but accidentally knocks over the crib in the process, awakening Jim Jr. Tramp kills the rat, but when Aunt Sarah comes to Jim Jr.'s aid, she didn't see the rat, and she thinks they are responsible for attacking the baby. Aunt Sarah forces Tramp into a closet and Lady into the cellar before calling the pound to take Tramp away and euthanize him. Jim Deer and Darling return to the dog catcher. Jim Deer and Darling return as the dog catcher departs with Tramp. When they arrive home, they release Lady. When they arrive home, they release Lady, who leads them and Aunt Sarah to the dead rat, vindicating Tramp. When they arrive home, they release Lady, who leads them and Aunt Sarah to the dead rat, vindicating Tramp. Having overheard everything, Trusty and Jock feel ashamed for how they mistreated and misjudged Tramp. To redeem themselves, they decide to chase after the dog catcher's wagon and rescue him. Jock is convinced Trusty has long since lost his sense of smell, but the latter is able to find the wagon. When Trusty and Jock race to the wagon, they bark at the horses, who rear up and lobble the wagon onto a telephone pole. Jim Deer arrives by car with Lady, and she is happy to be reunited with Tramp. But their happiness is short-lived when they discover that the wagon fell on Tramp, much to Jock's sadness. Happiness is short-lived when they discover that the wagon fell on Trusty, much to Jock's sadness. Christmas returns, and Tramp is now a part of Lady's family, and has his own collar and license as a reward for his heroism. The two dogs now have 4 puppies together: a son named Scamp. They now have 4 puppies together: a son named Scamp, who looks identical to Tramp, and 3 daughters named Annelle, Colette, and Danielle, who look identical to Lady. Jock and Trusty, who is carefully walking on his still mending leg, come to see the family. Tramp is happy to have finally become a house dog, and he and Lady live together happily with their children. What we can see here is that this film is a beautiful romantic comedy and is really and what I love about it is that it's so character driven, that there's no real antagonist, and this film doesn't need one. Yes, the dog catchers and Aunt Sarah kind of feel that antagonistic role, but ultimately the story is about Lady and Tramp, and ultimately it doesn't need a big bad to come swooping in and try and destroy their happiness. It's about them trusting each other. and learning to fall in learning. They learn to love each other, but also learn how to trust one another and see each other's worlds, the world of the streets, the world of the home, and truly what both of them really want. And that's what I adore about this film, and I adore that it's told through dogs. Anthropomorphic animals are just something that Disney is able to capture and really bring nuanced and stories through them. And these ideas are just really thought so well and ultimately bring this beautiful narrative throughout these films. So when it comes to Lady and the Tramp, when it comes to the video games, they're within Disney Infinity. No, they're not. When it comes to video games, Lady and the Tramp can be found within Disney Magic Kingdoms. They've had some other small appearances in like Disney Battle Mode. So, but ultimately they're not within the Kingdom Hearts. Despite not officially appearing in Once Upon a Time, there is a couple in the background of season 4 episodes. In season 4, episode 4, The Apprentice, where at an Italian restaurant, a man and a woman in the background are seen doing the iconic spaghetti scene. So it's very much inferred that that is Lady and the Tramp, and as we know with a lot of other animal characters, such as Gus, Minnie Cricket, that they become human after the curse. It's kind of inferred that that's probably them, which is really cool. So when it comes to the Disney parks, it's actually shockingly quite little for this classic. And ultimately, I'm honestly really shocked and surprised to see such little, considering how much of the 1950s Disney is in the parks and cemented the parks. It kind of shocks me how little there is of Lady and the Tramp compared to Cinderella, Peter Pan, Alice in Wonderland, Sleeping Beauty. It's quite bizarre. During the So Close sequence in World of Colour at Disneyland Resort, Lady can be seen having dinner with the Tramp. Over in Walt Disney World at Disney's Pop Century Resort, a statue of Lady and Tramp can be found in the 1950s section. In Fantasmic, a clip of Lady can be spotted during the bubble montage of Disney's Hollywood Studios version of the show alongside Tramp. Tony's Town Square restaurant in the Magic Kingdom, Lady and Tramp can be found in the decor. Also in the Magic Kingdom, both Lady and the Tramp briefly appear in Once Upon a Time during the Potts narration. During Mrs. Potts' narration. During the Epcot Flower and Garden Festival, topiaries of both Lady and Tramp are featured in the Italian Pavilion. And that is all it's... So, for such a iconic, beautiful film, I think the legacy that Lady and Tramp really has is the iconicness of that dinner scene. Everybody knows that when you do that spaghetti with spaghetti, you're doing the Lady and the Tramp scene. So ultimately, I think that's its biggest legacy compared to other media. You ultimately know what that is a reference to, and that's a genius, bold move from Walt Disney to have this really unique and lovely story cemented through a love of two dogs in the 1950s. And ultimately, that's where I'm going to leave this week's podcast. Thank you all for listening to this week's pod. I'd like to remind you that you can follow me on Instagram at StraightOnToDisneyPod, and you can email me your thoughts at StraightOnToDisneyPod@gmail.com. Also, don't forget to drop into the comments your thoughts on Lady and the Tramp. And if there's any other legacy that I missed out, you might know more. So, thank you all for listening, and bye!